Hello and welcome to This Must Be Talking Heads. I'm Rodney, your host, and the world's best and only Talking Heads historiologist. Today I'm presenting my conversation with author Jonathan Gould, who has a big new book about Talking Heads coming out, which is called Burning Down the House, Talking Heads and the New York Scene That Transformed Rock. We go in depth on the book, the history of it, and how it might differ from some of the other Talking Heads biographies that have been written over the years. And on that point, I wanted to offer a few quick thoughts about it before we get started. So having read the book, it's quite obvious to me that Jonathan Gould wants to present a bit of a different view of the history of Talking Heads, and particularly in light of David Byrne having what he calls a mild form of Asperger's, and how we might reevaluate some of the things that have happened in the band's history, the decisions that have been made, the choices that he made, the way he reacted to things. So I feel like Jonathan is trying to bring a bit more of a sympathetic and sort of modern understanding to how some of those things might be framed. So although I enjoyed the book, and overall I think it's a very good history of what happened across the band's tenure, when we reach some of those key flashpoint moments in the band's history where the tension is very high, he's very sympathetic towards David and less concerned about being as sympathetic to the rest of the band members. And I guess it was in those moments that I felt like I wasn't quite vibing with the book as much. And in the end, it leaves me a little bit uncertain about how I feel about some things. So I'd be keen to see what the reaction to this book is. I'd be keen to see what the Talking Heads fan base thinks of it. I'd be keen to see how it's thought of in the coming years. But that's what we're here to do. We're here to talk about Jonathan to get a better understanding about his approach to the book and what he set out to do and how he went about doing that. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jonathan Gould. It's fantastic to be talking to you. It's one of the things that's been on my radar for a little while is your book that's just come out. But thank you for making time for talking to me today.
My pleasure to be here, Rodney. And actually, my book has not yet come out. It's coming. Its publication date is June 17th. So I'm in a frenzy of self-promotion leading up to that.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I'm sure that if people want to know more details, this will only be one of many of the opportunities to dig a little deeper and find out a little bit more. The book, I'll read the full title just to do it justice. Burning Down the House, Talking Heads in the New York Scene That Transformed Rock by Jonathan Gould, 2025. I guess one of the key starting points is I need you to answer these questions for me. Why a book that you wrote? Why a book about this band and why now?
All very pertinent questions. So I started this in 2020, I guess it was. And it coincided with COVID, which was a good time to start writing a book because there wasn't anything else to do at that moment. I picked Talking Heads as a subject. Well, I guess I have to begin by saying previously I had written about, I had the incredibly original idea to write a book about the Beatles. But fortunately, I would hope a different kind of book about the Beatles that sort of established me a bit as a music writer. And then the next thing that I wrote was a biography of the soul star Otis Redding. And that actually started to suggest a certain trajectory because my own writing about music in general has sort of always been focused on two things. Without sort of doing the whole 9 yards, I started out as a professional musician. I'm a drummer. And I began writing about music because, among other things, I was somewhat dissatisfied at the extent to which people who wrote about popular music tended to avoid writing about the music. They seemed to write about everything else. So I wanted to write in detail, hopefully in readable prose, about what's actually happening in the music of the people that I'm interested in. But the other thing that I'm also interested in is the social and cultural context of popular music in particular, music in general, but popular music in particular. So the Beatles book was very largely about Britain in the 50s and 60s, the world that they grew up in. But the subtext to it, because this is the subtext to me of all Anglo-American popular music, is race, was race. Race has been a dimension of popular music since the beginning of popular music in North America and for that matter in Great Britain. So the Otis book came about because I wanted to write about a great soul musician. A very good book had already been written about Ray Charles, but nobody had written anything, in my view, of any import about Otis. So I focused on that. And then the question became, what was next? And I wanted to get out of the 60s. That was one of my ambitions. I made it
So
all the way
take me to the early to mid 70s, please.
yeah, I made it all the way to the 70s in this way, and on. There were several things about Talking Heads that intrigued me. First of all, they're contemporaries of mine. I'm the same age as them. I spent the second half of the 1970s and a few years in the beginning of the 1980s working with a cohort of musicians who I had encountered along the way, trying to put together a great rock and roll band. We came close, in my opinion, a couple of times, but it didn't happen. They did what I tried to do. And that there were two ways to go with that. One was to be enormously resentful of them, but the other was to be enormously interested and admiring of how it came about, how they did it. So that was one function. The other part of it, though, was that it takes me a long time to write these books. And so I want to pick subjects that I'm really sure of. I didn't want to get halfway through this thing and decide that I was really getting kind of tired of their music or tired of their personalities or tired of the whole phenomenon. And Talking Heads, while I was not that familiar with, so to speak, their personalities, with that aspect of the band, I was very familiar with their music and felt a great sense of kinship with their music because their roots in many ways were similar to my roots. When I was coming up, I was obsessed with Stax and Motown and that whole dimension of popular music. And some of them were, well, many of them were as well. So again, I felt that I was sure of them as a subject. And then to sort of bring it back around, this was a band that started out to be sort of kind of blunt about it, as maybe the whitest rock band that anybody had ever seen, or at least David Byrne was maybe the whitest rock musician that anybody had ever seen. And yet the story of their music is the story of their engagement with Black music, their incorporation of not just African American, or not just African American music, but also African and world music. And that fascinated me, that arc, that trajectory. So that was pretty much what drew me to them as a subject in that way.
And obviously the launch of this book is just the latest in sort of a bit of a series, a lineage of previous attempts to do biographies. And obviously I feel like as society moves forward, ideas and understandings about personalities and things change. So it feels like it's been a little while since we've had at least a good one that people will sort of respect and revere. And this seems like the latest attempt to modernize our thinking about things, recontextualize some things. So was that part of your motivation to do the book as well?
Yeah, very much. There had been a rather good sort of pocket biography that was written about them, and I think it came out in 1986, which of course was before the band, when the band was still together, was still making music. I learned a lot about that book. Actually, it's written by a non-existent person named Jerome Davis. And the reason for that is it was largely reported by a wonderful music writer named Bill Flanagan, who at a certain point became disenchanted with whatever was happening with the book. But the best reporting in it came from Bill, and then some other people who I don't know who they were finished it. But there were two issues with that. First of all, it did not talk all that much about the music. Mm-hmm. It was very good on reporting on, I would guess you could say, the personalities of people in the band, and I used a lot of that material, and I'm very grateful to Bill particularly for that. The next sort of serious attempt at a biography, of course, came in I think 2001, and it was by a Brooklyn novelist named was it
David Bowman?
David Bowman, yes. I always confuse him with Robert Bowman. Sorry about that. That was a book which actually began with the official cooperation. It was sort of authorized by Talking Heads. They all agreed to participate in it. And it turned into, as I describe it in the acknowledgments of my book, is yet another chapter in their history of dissension. Tina Weymouth in particular was utterly dismissive of the book. And I was not an admirer of that book. He had a glib, sort of knowing style. David had he's deceased now, so I don't want to go on about this. But I felt he had no real grasp of the music. There was something about his whole commitment to the idea of writing a serious book about a rock group that was kind of, he seemed ambivalent about that idea. He seemed to think that he had to sort of, in some ways, make excuses for it, I guess. So at any rate, that was my critique of the book.
Sure.
And I wound up using very little of what was in that, just because I was skeptical of a lot of it in that way. And then since then, the only thing of note that's been published in my view of a book length, of course, is Chris Franz's memoir, which came out in 2020. And when I contacted all of the Talking Heads when I began this book, or the former Talking Heads, soliciting their cooperation. I fully believed that I would get it, because I have a decent reputation as a music writer, and I am a contemporary of theirs, and I am somewhat musically knowledgeable. And I thought they would be interested in talking about their music all these years later. And each of them, I think for different reasons, had declined the invitation. And I'll briefly run those down. David,
sure.
One of the extraordinary features about David Byrne is his intense focus on whatever he is doing at any given moment. And David at that time was involved with the American Utopia show on Broadway, later involved in sort of reviving the American Utopia show when COVID interrupted its run. He was involved with Spike Lee's film. He had a lot on his plate, let's just put it that way. And I would say he can speak to this more clearly than I, but I think that David was simply not that interested in talking about the music that he made 40 or 50 or 40 or 35 years ago. It just isn't something that fired his imagination or fired his interest. In the case of Chris, when I contacted him, he told me that he had not yet published his memoir. He told me that he was about to publish a memoir, and as he put it, he wanted to save his stories for that.
Makes sense.
And I understood that. I wrote back and I said, I'm probably not that interested in your stories, but what I would like to do is talk to you about what's happening in the music. But anyway, there was no traction with that. Tina, I sort of dealt with mainly through Chris, and she at that time was also talking about writing a memoir. I don't know what's come of that or where that is, but so that presumably was her reason for not wanting to talk with me. And Jerry was the most affecting. Jerry was welcoming in a certain sense, but what he said to me, he said, John, I'd like to talk with you, but I don't want to be the only one. And that makes perfect sense also. It would have been very strange to have a book with contemporaneous quotes from Jerry Harrison and not from everybody else.
That's true.
And so on the basis of that, I did not use, I don't have any new material from them. I'll just say this about my technique as a writer or as a biographer. I'm always much more interested in what people said and did at the time than what they might say 30 or 40 years later about something that happened in that time. If I asked you about any aspect of your life that took place 30 years ago, what I would get from you, or if you asked me, is a curated story that you've been telling for a very long time.
Exactly.
And I'm not that interested. I'm interested, but that's not what I base my writing on.
I take the same approach, and if someone made a quote in 1978 about what was happening in 1978, I always give that more weight than something they said last year, because they've, like you say, they've told the story not just to themselves but to every interviewer in the whole world, and they've added little details and embellishments, and along the way, it just sort of, it's not that it's not authentic or genuine, it's just that it's colored in a way that can sometimes be minor, but can sometimes be major as well. But we take all these things with a grain of salt, like you sort of have to with everything, really.
Absolutely.
It's interesting to hear some of the things that you picked up on there. So I've just been patiently waiting till I can get the next question in, which is something along the lines of this book. You've called it out there to say some of the previous attempts have been just biographies or histories of the people. Some of them, there are books that are just, here's the albums and here's every song, and I'm just going to write about every song, and that's what that is. And this book, I sensed before I even knew that much about it, I sensed that this was going to try to be all of those things. It was going to try to be the book. It was going to try and be the one with musical insights, personal insights, cultural insights. and I think I can tell that you've put a lot of effort into trying to do that. Before I get into some of the sort of rhythm and beats of the book, to put it
Sure.
that way,
Yeah.
I just want to get some read back from you about that's the sort of book you tried to set out to do.
Yeah, no, all of my books have tried to do all of the above, I guess is the simplest way to describe it, without compartmentalizing it. I mean, at least in terms of the voice of the book, my voice as a writer.
Yeah.
I don't, it's not like I put on my cultural hat and then I put on my musical hat and then I put on my biographical hat.
It's
But
all mixed together though.
yeah, but to me, to integrate all of those dimensions of a creative life, or in this case,
Mm.
a set of creative lives, is the goal. Because the one thing I'll say is this: I spent quite a few years working in the music business. And I know that there are many people who are, and I don't, it's not that I don't regard myself as a fan of the music I'm a fan of. I am a fan. But I know that many people who are devout fans of this artist or that artist or this band or that think they're just the most fascinating people in the world. But my experience in the music business, and I won't speak about anything more, is that with rare exceptions, just about the only thing that's interesting about most of the musicians I know is the music that they made. They're
Yes.
not extraordinary personalities, except as they manifest themselves in the music. They're not fascinating conversation partners. One of the interesting things about Rolling Stone magazine, which of course I grew up with, sort of as a contemporary of it, was this desire to present rock musicians as worthy of long sort of literary interviews of the sort that the New Yorker or at another time Playboy magazine did, and the results are really sort of comical. A few of them work out rather well. If you have a Pete Townsend, maybe you might get something there, but for the most part, they're pretty tiresome. Those, I mean, I have to read them all as a function of my work, right? I have
Yeah.
to pore over them, but I'm just saying. So yes, the goal was to integrate all of these dimensions of it, of the story.
The introductory part about the New York scene I thought was very interesting and very well researched and informed about the players and whose house everyone was hanging out at, and the scene then progresses into CBGBs as if they just go down the stairs from that living room, walk across the street, and they're all hanging out in CBGBs. And isn't this a cool place? Hey, there's David Bowie, there's whoever. Was that part of the appeal as much as the band, as the fact that, hey, if I talk about this band, I also get to talk about this cool scene?
Well, sure, and I guess the other dimension of this that I didn't mention in terms of why I wrote this book is I'm a New Yorker. I grew up in New York. And having written about Britain and having written about Macon and Memphis and places like that, I wanted an opportunity to write about the city that I grew up in and that I still live in, at a very interesting time in its history, a dire time in terms of its political and social history, but oddly enough, a very rich time in terms of its cultural history. And that's another one of the dynamics that I'm trying to get at here. There's a lot of reference to the decline of New York City on most of the parameters that we would choose to recognize. But strangely enough, in this, out of this sort of downtown dystopia, this very rich art scene emerged.
Yeah.
And
It's almost a
that's
precondition for a good art scene, though.
Well, I guess so. Although there have been great art scenes in various imperial periods in
I
countries'
suppose
histories and
that's true.
things like that. This sort of thing. But at any rate, this one was fascinating in that regard, especially because it was in one sense very provincial. It was happening in a couple of clubs, in a couple of pretty out of the way neighborhoods. In fact, neighborhoods that now are household names, but at the
Yes.
time, in 1965, nobody referred to Soho, nobody
Yeah,
referred
it's true.
to Tribeca or
Yeah.
places like that. That was all a product of this same period. And I guess what I'm saying is that yes, to write about that scene. Now, the one thing I will say though is that from the very beginning, and this is to me one of the points I want to make about the book. Tina Weymouth said something about this. David Byrne said something about this. They were a complete anomaly at CBGB's. CBGB's became a punk scene. It didn't start that way. Nobody would describe television as a punk band, but people would describe the Ramones in some ways as the archetype of a punk band. But almost from the time they arrived there, and certainly from the time they, departed in 1977, very much like the Beatles, as soon as they made their first album, that was the end of their relationship with this seeding ground that they had. They were an anomaly there. I describe them as the albino in the herd, because they just were, and they were never that accepted there. Their fans accepted them there, but in terms of the milieu of that club, and certainly what it became, they were outliers. They were not sort of at the center of that sensibility, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely true. Certainly in terms of the aesthetic and the I guess to a degree the look, even to a greater degree the sound. But they sort of get announced as the group from that scene when the scene is discovered. So that really the only way for them to move forward or progress or go anywhere was to leave and go beyond, and which is more or less what they did kind of straight away. I do want to start getting into some of the music. That's really some of the meat of it, and you've done such a good job describing the music in the book. It's one of those great things that happens when you read a good music book is that you read the discussion of the lyrics or the music, and you can sort of hear the song playing in your head, and then you put the book down and go, I want to listen to that music now.
Wonderful.
So I wanted to acknowledge that I had that effect on me, and I'm sure it will have that effect on everybody that reads it. But the first few albums, obviously, they just straight out of the gate are right onto something winning. Tensions with Tony Bon Jovi on their first album aside, you sort of highlight that he went through the songs that they had and maybe picked out some of the ones that he thought were sort of viable as a kind of album. One thing that surprised me, Jonathan, is that you said, "Oh, it's a bit weird that he picked out Who Is It and First Week, Last Week, Carefree. They're a bit weak." And I was like, "What is this? What weak?" some of my favorites. I wanted to roll together 77 and More Songs a little bit in the sense that I think, like, First Week, Last Week, Carefree has a bit of a spiritual sibling in The Good Thing. And I wonder how much the impact of literally just having a title like 77, minimal, conceptual, mysterious, and then a playful, jovial title like More Songs About Buildings and Food makes a song like the Good Thing just, you're ready for it. You're primed for it to some degree, even though it's just abstract nonsense, kind of like First Week, Last Week is.
Yes. Well, I think that's true. I think what's interesting about their first two albums is that, again, because of just the dynamics of the band and the fact that Jerry Harrison had recently joined, which meant that he wasn't familiar with their entire repertoire. He was familiar with the songs that they were currently playing. In some ways, the songs on the first album are newer for the most part than the songs on the second album, and that creates an interesting dynamic. The difference, however, of course, is that the band on the second album is a much more accomplished band than the one on the first album. So that whole part of that fascinated me. If I can just jump in with one thing, one of the things that I don't hesitate to do, and one of the things that I always expect whenever I publish a book, is that I do express opinions about songs.
True.
What's good, what isn't good, what strikes me as good, what strikes me as not. I have favorite songs. I have songs that I put a lot of attention to. I have songs that I sort of sweep aside a little bit. And so, Who Is It is a good example of that. On the one hand, it's a very funny sort of song. I believe that I say it might delight a small child in that sense. And that's not to say that it wouldn't delight a big child also. Right. But I'm very used to the idea. What always happens to me is people who read my books, they come back at me and they say, "You didn't like that song? How could you say that about Hey Bulldog?" Right. Or whatever. Right. And that's part of the fun of listening to popular music, of engaging seriously with popular music. This is something I've been doing my whole life with my friends and my readers, is having these conversations. And I hope that people will not be sort of put off by the idea. Some people come away from it saying, "God, he's such an opinionated guy." Well, that's kind of my job as a writer.
Well, without an opinion, this is a short book. I mean, it's one of those things too. When someone writes about an album and they say this song's a bit weak, and you know in yourself, in your heart, that it's a bit weak, you kind of go, "Oh, this
Yeah,
guy gets it." Which is what happened when I was reading the Fear of Music section. Then you started talking about electric guitar because I'm not a fan of electric guitar, but I
yeah,
know in my community there are people who don't like hearing
absolutely.
that, and I
Yeah.
have the same reaction you just had.
One reviewer said it was the best song on the album. I forget who it was. It was an English reviewer in one of the British papers, and he just flat out he said, this is the best song on the album. Great.
Hmm. I don't know if that guy's alive, but I would like to talk to that guy. And it's also humbling because I've gone through all of the band's discography so many times and read all the lyrics and tried to find all of the little connections. He mentions eating nuts and berries in animals, and he mentions eating nuts and berries in Nothing But Flowers. But the one that I'd never picked up on, which was staring me right in the face, and you call out, is in cities. In London, people sleep in the daytime, and then in life during wartime, of course, they sleep during the daytime, work in the
Yes.
nighttime.
Yeah.
And I had my head in my hands, Jonathan. I was like, "What are you? How have I never seen that one?"
Listen,
Just blind
David's
to it.
David's interests slash obsessions are very circular. He comes back often to themes that he has already raised. And that's putting it rather mildly, I would say. That's one of the interesting things about his work.
I think, and I have this too, is that when you decide that something is the way that something should be, you don't really deviate too much from it because you've already done the thinking and made the decision. And every time you reevaluate, you revalidate. No, I
Yeah.
was right for it to be that way. I feel
Mhm.
like David's maybe a little bit like that too. But Fear of Music, you mentioned Jerry Harrison before, and I think I think that's one of his favorite albums of
Mhm.
theirs. The one that he maybe has it's closest to his heart because he got to make that contribution. And I think things with the band and Brian Eno were firing a little bit better on that album. It was fresh
Very much.
material that wasn't from 4 years ago. All those factors playing into that just being one of the really good albums.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that Izimbra is they regarded it as a breakthrough for them. It was their
Sure.
breakthrough into the world of Afrobeat in that sense. There are issues about the song. I forget. I think it was Tom Car. Oh, I forget who the writer was who said even racist old Hollywood doesn't doesn't present nonsense chants as African. But it's a brilliant it's a brilliant song. It's something that they could never have done without Brian Eno,
It's
who
true.
of course suggested the use of the Hugo Ball poem,
Yeah.
and thereby connected them to that whole Dada tradition in that way, which they brushed against in art school, but only brushed against, I think, in that way. But the other thing about one of the interesting things about Fear of Music is that David Byrne has been straightforward about the fact that he started writing in a different way, in a more conceptual way. It's one of the reasons that so many of the songs on that record have these one-word titles.
Mm.
You could see the way he would like take a subject, and then try to do something with it. Cities, air, this sort of thing,
Hmm.
right? That's kind of fascinating to me. But he was very upfront about the fact that it was very experimental for him, and I think at one time said that maybe half the songs on that record, in his view, really succeeded on a lyrical level in writing that way. The other fascinating thing about it, though, of course, is that the song that everybody fixates on that album, which is Life During Wartime, is this stream of narrative. It's unlike anything else on the record, and it seems like it just sort of flowed out of him. In
Mm.
I suspect it didn't, but that's what it feels like, which is what good writing does feel like. It rarely is, but feels like, and that gives it a kind of power, because all of a sudden the song is just almost telling its own story in that way, and I love that about it.
And not only stepping into a different perspective or a different psychology, but stepping into a different world, which it's not that David's never done that, but this just felt like once he
Mhm.
started exploring that world, it just kept coming to him, and he just I
Yes,
mean, not to say he just sat there, like you say, it didn't all just flow out of him. I'm sure he struggled like he always did,
of
but
course.
it felt like the details just kept presenting to themselves the more he looked for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, it is a critique in its way, in this sort of backhanded way of the scene that they had sort of emerged from. But it's also, it's also a critique of. I mean, it's a political critique in that way. It's very hard for me to imagine that it takes a sympathetic view. Well, it takes a sympathetic view of the type of radicals,
Yes, yes,
radical
yes, yes, yes.
politics that turned into a form of terrorism in the
Mhm.
1970s. But it's more sort of, I mean, in the same way he was fascinated with the persona of a psycho killer. This
Yeah.
is another psycho killer, or at least this is a would-be psycho killer, I guess is a good way to describe it, right?
And for the most part, they sort of, or I feel like it's a very conscious thing that they veer away from being explicitly political. And that seems
Sure,
like a weird thing to say. They have this song, Don't Worry About the Government, which I think is political in its way. But I mean, everything is like removed or obfuscated or presented in a roundabout way. So it's never too much. You're never sitting there listening to the song going, I'm uncomfortable because of how political you are. But it's all
sure.
in there. If it's all, it's part of the layers. It's all in there.
And it's inviting you to create your own interpretation of it, which
For
is
sure.
which is important. In other words, there's nothing in there that says this is the way you must feel about this, which
Yes.
is another aspect of good writing, or at
Yep.
least what I regard as good writing.
Absolutely, and we're obviously obliged to talk a lot about Remain in Light, although we'll try we'll try and do our best to not just say the same thing that everybody always says. But a real landmark album for them, one that just changes everything, changes how they play a live show, what songs they play, what instrumentation they do, just changes the whole game for them, as if they haven't already made their mark. I mean, everything is turned on its head.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and again, whatever the nature of the genesis of it, right? There's Tina's story about, or there's Chris's story about Tina sort of enticing David and Brian to
Yeah.
play with them and all of that sort of thing. I somehow think that I don't think David was going anywhere at that point, to be perfectly blunt about it. I think one of the things that was difficult for them to understand was the idea that he could go off and work with Eno on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. This was not him joining some other band or something like this. This was simply the way that David was setting up his creative career in that sense. So anyway, the truth is they did come back together. Eno did agree to produce the record, although I was fascinated by, I think I described his own description of it as very carefully hedged in terms
Mm.
of the way he described his role. He was very clear that this would not be a production in the usual sense, that he would, in his mind, in some sense, be joining the band, and then, as he put it, pushing these ideas that he was interested in at that time. And fortunately, David and maybe to a less avid extent, Jerry, were also very interested in, or became very interested in those ideas. David already was, as a result of My Life in the Bush of
Yeah.
Ghosts. And Chris and Tina had the musical capability to go along with it. Was the important thing. They made clear they were not on the program in some ways, in terms of the fascination with African music, or at least the fascination with African music. Or when I say African music, I'm talking about African popular music,
Mhm.
that David and Eno had. But the truth of the matter is, musically, they were capable of keeping up with that and adding to it, and that was the important thing.
Yeah, I think obviously there's the spark that Eno and Brian and Eno and David brought to the sessions and to the whole approach. We're going to
Mhm.
do it's going to be polyrhythmical, it's going to be contrapuntal, it's going to be all these things. But I mean, there's that sort of post album reflection back on the album to say, oh, it's like an African album, and the others were like, well, it's not an African album, it's a Talking Heads album, and
Right.
it's to them they didn't think of it as an African album at all, but I guess to the others they were like, well, the roots are there, we grew our own thing out of that, but we understood what the roots were, So
Sure.
I guess how you get to the end product is one of those things that Eno is sort of a master at, in saying, I'm going to set up these rules and we're going to discover as we go.
Right.
That's something that he's always thinking in that mode. But the others were probably thinking, well, you guys are playing something in that time and it's this fast, so I'll play along and add my
Sure.
bit, and then
Yeah.
we'll end up with a song.
The other aspect of it that isn't emphasized enough is that it's all very well to talk about Afro-pop music, to talk about Fela Kuti and to talk about King Sunny Ade, but the influence of American R&B, particularly James Brown, and then
Yes,
later
huge.
on funk, on Fela Kuti and Sunny Ade and the whole Afro-pop scene was enormous. It's in that sense, and the reason was that I mean there's this marvelous circular sort of back and forth
Yes.
between the whole influence of African music on American music, and then the influence of African American music on African music. And to me, we always assume, let me put it this way, in the West, in the US particularly, we always assume that the flow of influence goes one way. And what we fail to understand often is that America and Britain too has been pumping out this music around the world, right? Since the 60s, particularly. And although jazz before that had an enormous influence, but since the 60s particularly, and thanks to radio, all across everybody who lived in cities in Africa knew about James Brown because they heard him on the radio, for goodness
Yeah.
sakes, right? And that was a very important dimension. So in some ways, Chris and Tina, to the extent that they were grounded in American R&B, were ready to play this music.
Yes, absolutely. They just come hand in hand in some ways
Yeah.
because of that circular nature that you mentioned before. Excellent. So I think we've ticked the box. We've done our duty. We've talked about Remaining Light. So there's, no one's going to get mad at us now. Maybe we could go through sort of Speaking in Tongues and Stop Making Sense as a bit of a dual package, because they're
Mhm.
so intertwined. So many people talk about how the versions of the songs in Stop Making Sense are just so much superior than the album versions. I mean, I can appreciate them all, but I think it's
Sure.
kind of acknowledged that those two projects are just so tightly intertwined that it's almost hard to talk about one without talking about the other.
Mhm.
And it's also obviously really, I think, and a lot of people think that sort of Stop Making Sense is just it's the pinnacle of the band's achievement creatively, redefining again. They've only done it a few years earlier, but again, they've just shown that that was not their ceiling at all.
Oh, absolutely. And listen, I mean, the other dimension that we haven't spoken about here is that in their early days, one of the anomalous qualities about Talking Heads was the way that they looked on stage. I won't say that other rock groups, that one can't name other rock groups that were equally frozen on stage, but between David's uh, again, the need to early on to carry the songs by singing and playing, by
Yeah.
doing so much of the heavy lifting as far as that goes. That began to change when Jerry joined the band, but still, David as a performer, up until really the advent of the so-called Expanded Heads, the band that was put together after Remain in Light to perform that material live, was an extremely a compelling but very static performer. And of course, along the way there, he had an involvement with Twyla Tharp, who was one of the great choreographers of her generation. He also had a romantic entanglement with her. They created the Catherine Wheel, but that exposed David to this whole downtown dance scene, which at that time was the most important. I think most people would say was probably not just Twyla, but other people in that scene, was probably the most important sort of thing that was happening in modern dance.
Hmm.
And so David sort of round about 1980 discovers physical movement as another
Yes.
no, literally
Yes.
as
Yes.
something
Yes.
to add to his vocabulary as an
Yes.
artist. And by the time of the Speaking in Tongues tour, he's filled with ideas. He's filled with ideas about how to present the band, because it wasn't just about dance. It was also in working with an artist of Twyla Tharp's caliber. He's working with lighting directors. He's
Yeah.
working with the whole theatrical apparatus of presentation. and which until then, Talking Heads, like many rock groups, had sort of treated as if there was something artificial about it, as if theater was one thing, rock had this authenticity about it. We go on stage and we are the way we are, right? It's not a performance.
And the song is so good, it doesn't matter what you do with the lines because the
Exactly,
song
exactly.
rocks so hard. But
Right.
without realizing that this is an emotional journey you're taking people on, and you can play in all the different fields.
Sure. And as David put it, I mean, very articulately, he eventually understood that to get up on stage is itself a performance. It's
Yeah,
itself, there's artifice to it. If you pretend that there is an artifice to it, that's part of the
that's the
artifice
first two.
that you're
Yes, exactly.
buying into in that way. So suddenly, he is, in addition to applying his creative sensibility and his creative intelligence to the music, he's also now in a big way applying it to what's happening on stage. And of course, the other thing about the extended band and then the other incarnations of the extended band is that the other performers that they're working with, whether it's Steve Scales or whether it's Delette McDonald or and so on and so forth, these are they're exuberant performers, right? And they draw the heads out. Because if you're on, if you're on stage with these people, Adrian Belew is, he's like a puppet on a string in terms of the way he
Yes.
bounds around playing guitar, things like this. If you're on stage with people like that, they're going to loosen you up very quickly. And that's
Yeah.
what began to happen over the course of the early 80s. And by the time we get to Speaking in Tongues, yes, they are becoming much looser. And the tour that follows Speaking in Tongues, which is the precursor to the Stop Making Sense tour, is the first tour in which David on some songs stops playing guitar and instead dances. The other influence on him, of course, was Toni Basil and the music videos that he began making with her. But he becomes interested in dance, and he does essentially the same thing with dance that he did with music, which is that he creates his own utterly idiosyncratic style of doing it, which, well, however much awkwardness is a part of it, it's a presentation of awkwardness. It's not mere awkwardness. It's a dramatization of awkwardness, I guess, is a good way to describe it.
I guess so.
And what do you know? Very quickly gets very, very good at this. And I think that's something that nobody ever could have imagined about them in that way.
That's probably true. It would be hard to
Yeah,
imagine someone standing in CBGBs in 1976, watching
sure.
David Byrne then and thinking, oh, in 7 years' time, this guy will be like waving his arms around like a flappy man and doing all
Exactly.
that kind of stuff.
And of course, this is what Jonathan Demme picked up on immediately when he saw the band. He'd seen them once before in Central Park, and I guess 1979, I believe it was. And he said they just stood there like statues on the stage. And now suddenly they were this dynamic troupe of performers,
Yeah.
right? And his reaction to it, it's a chapter title in my book, but he said, oh, this is a movie waiting to be made, in the sense that it was all there.
Yeah.
And one of the things about the film that's so extraordinary is that Demme had the sensibility and the taste and the intelligence to realize he didn't have to engage in all of the cinematic sort of cliches that had developed around the idea of presenting rock music or particularly rock music on film. Of which, Martin Scorsese's The Last Waltz is probably the greatest example, not of the cliches, but but in that mode. And it was very funny to me, to realize, I'm sure that people will, some readers will maybe tire of my need to talk about the Beatles as
I was going to bring it up.
the authors of so much of what we take for granted about rock and roll. But until A Hard Day's Night, nobody had made a film about a rock group or a popular entertainer, even though there it was done satirically, in which you had these backstage scenes and you had these interviews with the performers and all of that sort of thing. What Richard Lester did satirically in A Hard Day's Night, almost every rock movie since then, or let's say every rock movie from 1964 until I think I would like to hope that, although it wasn't true, that this is Spinal Tap finally put an end to this genre.
They
But
did.
from there until Spinal Tap, which came out the year before Stop Making Sense, I might add, um, th that became the model without the satire,
Mm.
where you'd go backstage and you'd see the fans filling the concert hall, and you showed all in the machinery of the production. And Demi's great insight was to say, no, we're just gonna set up cameras and film this beautifully, and that's essentially what he did.
I mean, it's obviously a standout achievement, just an achievement from all of them as an ensemble, and even the things like, I guess I wanted to get into some of these dynamics along the lines of the songs that appear on David's solo album for the Catherine Wheel, or the music that was for the production that they
Mhm.
did, and then the transformation of them into really powerhouse live songs, and how everybody is absolutely firing on all cylinders to elevate that to the level that it gets elevated to, and how that really shows the craft that they had all developed, and the way that they were also tight playing with each other. And seemingly they were all told, you will play some of David's solo songs, but it seems like there was no like phoning it in. It's like, we are just going to play our asses off and make this as good as we can.
No, absolutely. And listen, by that time, David, Chris and David collaborated on the lyrics and maybe a bit of the music on some of the early songs. But one of the funny things was there was always this sort of strange ambivalence in Talking Heads about the idea that David wrote all the music.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is, there is a part of this that needs to sort of get teased out a little bit, and I talk about it, which is that anybody who's played in a rock band over the last 50 years or so is aware that the way that rock groups developed their arrangements of songs was quite different from the way that was previously done in the music business. There used to be people called arrangers, and someone would write a song, and an arranger would write an arrangement of that song, which would be written, and then musicians who were capable of reading music would play that arrangement, and so on. That was the norm for a very, very long time in the music business. Rock groups changed all of that, and they changed all of that because of the way that they tended to work out jazz bands did this also, but what they called head arrangements, which meant that they would start with the song and they would play it and they would tease it out and they would bring it in this direction or that direction, and
Yep.
so on and so forth. All of that said, arrangement is a critical element. In some ways, in some forms of some recordings, in some forms of pop music, it is the critical element. But nevertheless, writing a song consists of words, melody, and chords, right? And for the most part, David was responsible for those three dimensions of Talking Heads music from the beginning through the end in that way. And as a result, and Jerry contributed particularly to a number of those, and certainly during the era when they were working out arrangements as a band, starting with nothing. Chris and Tino and Eno and anybody else who was joining the session played an enormous role in that also. But I think it's important to understand that this was basically a band with one writer in it. And everything that they started was sort of initiated in one way or another, I would say, by David, with some rare exceptions in that way. And that caused a lot of tension, and because there are economic implications to that, it also caused a lot of resentment over the years. But that's part of the dimension of this band.
There's been some of the biographies and some of the history of the band that has focused in on that sort of economic element, I guess, almost pointing to that as one of the core elements. Another core element might just be David's personality and his desire to have his name next to anything that anybody likes and appreciates, and wants to be acknowledged for his own, like you say, vision. The original vision and the execution might have gone off in different strands, but originally the core idea came from here, as far as he's concerned. But I think bring it back to the book and some of the positioning that you do as well. And as we work through these next few albums, which are heavily led by David, he wrote the songs, brought them to the band, and they sort of played through them with him. But I mean, they were Talking Heads songs, and the band members made contributions, but it's sort of acknowledged that David had written them in a very different way and brought them to the band in in a way that they hadn't done before. And the tension from this point forward really just ramps up. And then I wanted to also, I guess, to be explicit, you're here to talk about the book. Some of
Mhm.
the ways that you present those situations in your book, I feel are a little bit of an attempt to, what would you say, reflect modern values and understandings and sympathies about David's being on the spectrum and his neurodivergent
Well, yeah, I
perspective
mean,
on the world. So, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
sure, I would love to. This is, to my knowledge, this is the first thing that's been written about talking heads that talks about David Byrne's Asperger's, as it was once called. It's now referred to as high functioning autism. It's colloquially referred to as being on the spectrum, right?
Sure.
It talks about that dimension of him as a function of his artistic personality, his artistic sensibility. Um, uh, and I think it's very, it exerts an enormous, it has always exerted an enormous influence on that. I steeped myself in learning about not just high functioning autism, not just Asperger's syndrome, but more or less the discovery of this phenomenon over the course of the period that I'm writing about. When David was growing up, there was no such thing as Asperger's syndrome. It hadn't been recognized. It hadn't at least not in the United States or not in the West. And there was no understanding of this. Autism, it's sort of interesting in light of what's happening currently in the US around this conversation.
Mm.
Autism was thought of as this utterly debilitating neurological condition that caused babies and small children not to be able to communicate, not to be totally shut off from the world. And that was the focus of what this meant. The person Asperger, who was a German or actually Austrian psychiatrist, had written about, had also studied autism from the very beginning, and had written about this small group of patients that he had, who he referred to as his little professors. And these were people who, yes, had some of the communicative difficulties that people with autism have, but and a lot of the social anxiety, all of the social anxiety that people with high functioning, what turned out to be called high functioning autism had, but also had often had extraordinary cognitive or creative or scientific abilities that manifested themselves very early. And they had enormous powers of concentration. They had enormous powers and a capacity, for lack of a better term, for original thought. And the reason I think we're slowly starting to understand is that people on the spectrum, from a very early age, if they are high functioning, study the existence of other people very,
Yeah.
very closely, because they're trying to learn how to live in this world. That is to say, how to live in the world of neurotypical people. And that causes them to pay enormous amounts of attention and to look at the way the rest of us, if we could describe ourselves as neurotypical, which is another conversation to
Don't
have,
go
right?
there.
The way the rest of us navigate the world.
Mm. Yeah.
And so much of David's sensibility as an artist, as a writer, is based on this slightly sort of skewed, from our point of view of how people behave, how people get themselves through the day, how people get themselves through the world. And now we become very accustomed to the idea that large numbers of creative people, notable creative people, are, so to speak, on the spectrum. And this applies to the sciences, it applies to the arts, it applies to the whole range of human achievement in that way. So yes, I wanted to write about this in relation to him. David, I would not have done it if David himself had not at one point diagnosed himself, so to speak, as having, he described as a very mild, I think, case of Asperger's, right?
Well, I think it's valid for him to diagnose himself as having a case of Asperger's. For it to be mild is where I might be like, well, that's probably something we could talk further about. But okay,
Right.
let's just move on from there, acknowledging that you're embracing something about who you are, and that's a positive thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, and anyway, to me, it's an enormous part of the story, and it's an enormous part also of because this was all taking place in a period when there was no awareness of this,
Yes.
right? Um, Many of the things about David that other people had, particularly people in the band, had difficulty with, found considered to be self-centered, considered to be egotistical. This is not to say that he wasn't that, or that he. I won't speak about him now. That in that period, that he wasn't that. He was. He manifested. Hans Asperger's described his little professors as egotistical in the extreme, right? And it has to do with the fact that they are so focused on what they're doing that yes,
Mm.
they tend to blot out a lot of dimensions, other dimensions of what people around them are doing. But another critical dimension of it, and this is the part that I hope people will understand. I had enormous help on this book from a very gifted writer and music critic named Tim Page, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning classical music critic for the Washington Post. And Tim is one of the people who, right around the same time as David, came to the realization that he had grown up with Asperger's.
Right.
Tim wrote a brilliant memoir, which I'm eager to plug to anybody who's listening,
Go ahead.
called Parallel Play. It first appeared as an article in the New Yorker, and then he published it as a book. And it's a memoir of growing up, a retrospective memoir of growing up with Asperger's, seen now with the knowledge of what was going on. And Tim is very eloquent about describing what the struggle of people with this condition have. And one of the things that he writes about is how people with Asperger's have to work at developing a sense of empathy, which is what causes us to be aware of other people and their feelings. It's the whole category of behavior that involves that. And there's a wonderful line from Tim's book that I think also applies to David, which is he says that just because that my sense of empathy, of other people's feelings and all of that is hard won rather than hardwired, is hard earned rather than hardwired, comes from observing this, doesn't make it any less genuine. And I think that's a really important thing to understand about anybody who's on the spectrum, but in this case, because we're talking about David, which is that and we see that in the personality and the performer that he is now, because he's been working on this his whole life, and he's come a very long way in terms of that. And it's, to me, that's something to be admired. That's something to be celebrated. And I try to do that subtly enough in the context of the book.
There's a few elements to that I find really interesting. One of them is, like, obviously it became very obvious to me from very early on in the book that was something you introduced and that you intended to return to it just as a way, not even as a way of, hang on, this might look like a bit of a dodgy situation, but time out. Remember that David's on this. Like, it wasn't like that. It was more about just it's about reaching a place of improved understanding, which is obviously a very positive thing. David obviously now has a big following with people who identify in the same way that he does, and he's a bit of a poster child for them and a role model for them, which is brilliant and fantastic. And I'm sure a lot of those people will pick up on those threads that you put into the book. So they will, I'm sure that as they're reading it, they will be their hearts will be filled with joy or hard-won empathy for the effort that you put into achieving that. And one of the interesting elements that I think that then plays out as you roll through, like we've been sort of roughly going through the band's chronology, is that we hit this point where David acts a certain way. Nobody understands why he's doing that, and it creates frustration, which then gets fed back to David, which then makes him frustrated, which then feeds back to the band, and it just spirals. It just completely spirals out of control. So I guess I wonder to what degree, having established all of that now as a foundation for one of the approaches you took in the book, to what degree did you feel that you had to, for want of better words, right some wrongs of history by just reminding people this is how David is. He wasn't just an asshole. There were it was more complex than that, and a bit of sympathy and empathy for what he was going through will repay itself in terms of better understanding.
Oh, very definitely. I mean, I did feel that. I mean, again, there's some people, there are people who have been fans of David Byrne from the moment they first encountered him, who never, who've never thought about this whole,
Sure.
never thought about the edges of his personality, or in that sense, never thought about the things that rubbed other people the wrong way, as far as this goes. But yes, and it particularly relates to a comment that he talks about. Again, as much as possible, I try to use people's own words in
Yes.
describing what they think and so on and so forth. And I can't quote it exactly, but there is this David talking about his social anxiety as a young man, talking about how feeling so out of sorts in social situations. He said, I would have loved to, I would be happy to be this gregarious, happy person who knows how to get along with everybody, but I realized that's not who I was. And so he said, so, my strategy was to glom on to somebody who was that way and let them be the one who brings everybody in, he says. And then he goes on to say, it sounds very calculated, but it wasn't as much, right? And I think in that statement, in that last statement, is a lot of the issue around how
That's true.
he's been perceived.
I
Because
would agree.
many people, including members of the Talking Heads, came to think it was all very calculated. And I don't think it was, because I don't think it is calculated in that way. Yes, it is a strategy of somebody, but I think what I've been trying to get at all through the book in one way or another, because I know people who are, again, we'll use the term on the spectrum because that's what we call nowadays. I think what neurotypical people don't understand is really what a struggle certain basic forms of interaction are for them. And the fact that they do as well at it as they do in many cases causes us to think there's no issue there. There's no problem. We don't understand how hard they might be working at some of these things, and how much they are in the position of having to adapt to the way that we perceive things. Again, I'm talking about us as examples of neurotypicality. Whereas, it wouldn't be totally unreasonable to think of, well, why aren't they trying to adapt to the way we are? Because we have things that are of great value that that people seem to appreciate enormously. Why is all the adaptation on our part in that way? Now, I've never seen David hint at that. I do have neurodiverse friends who have become sufficiently emboldened over the years that they will articulate those feelings, and they're to be listened to in that regard. And I think the other dimension of this that relates to, and I get to this really at the very end, or toward the very end of the book, is all of these people came from relatively privileged backgrounds. But David is unusual in that regard for two reasons. First of all, his background was less privileged socioeconomically than the other three, all of whom came from what I would describe, and this is true of myself, upper middle, what we call in America upper middle class families, which is, we had professional parents, right? So on and so forth. In David's case, his parents, they were Scots, so they tended to minimize any sense of economic comfort, right? They were always very right. But first of all, they were Scots. His parents were working class Scots who had come up in the world. His father had gotten a university degree. His mother went on to get a university degree. Both of them were seemingly, from everything I can tell, quite brilliant. Their sensibility, their values were those of English working class people. And I learned a lot about that writing about the Beatles. It's a very different world. Working class in Britain is very different from working class in America, in a lot of different ways. And so while David, yes, was privileged enough that his parents could afford to send him to a college like RISD, which was not true of most of the people in the high school that he went to in suburban Maryland. Nevertheless, their whole outlook was much more, I'm not going to say lower middle class, but was much less privileged. Okay, I think the important dimension of that is that created a sense of ambition in him, a drive in him that is fairly rare in upper middle class people. Upper middle class people, Chris and Tina became artists or went to art school and went on to become musicians. This was an appealing choice to them. But the point is, it was a choice. In David's case, there weren't that many choices. And certainly as soon as he received his first recognition for anything really that he'd done in a serious way, which was as a young musician in New York in the second half of the 1970s, that glimmer of success, he seized on that in a way with a drive, I think, that the others didn't have. And other people who encountered him along the way recognized it. Twyla Tharp recognized it. She said from the moment she met him, she realized they shared a kind of ambition that most of us don't have. We may go on and do good things. We may, but there's another kind of ambition that often causes people like David Byrne to go very, very far. I don't think it's necessarily a pleasant thing to live with in oneself, because there's a drive there, there's a compulsion, and he had that, and the others didn't have that, I don't think, in nearly the same degree. And that also caused a lot of emotional and psychological tension in the band, because he was operating on a different level of what he wanted from the world, you know?
So I think it's sort of become clear, even just in us talking now, that once we sort of opened that little door there, there was a lot of room inside that,
It's a big
beyond
part
that
of it.
door.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I know it's simmering, sometimes at the surface and sometimes below the surface, all the way through the book. But I guess I wonder, if you were to flash forward 5 years and ask someone, hey, you remember that book from 5 years ago about Talking Heads that came out? What did you think of that? Do you think that they would say that was the time when it was the first time that someone tried to demystify David Byrne? And it's a book about Talking Heads, but it's really a book about David Byrne and trying to just provide a counter narrative to the established narrative. Is that something would that be a success for you?
That would absolutely be a success for me. I mean, I don't know if it's a counter narrative. It's more, to me, it's expanding the narrative in an important way. And the other thing I want to say about it is, we've been talking about it a lot. I think it's really important to recognize, and I hope this is reflected in the book. This is not the Rosetta Stone of David Byrne. This is not the thing that explains everything about David Byrne. This is something that explains one dimension of David Byrne that feeds into both his creative sensibility and also how he has presented himself as a person. But it's not the be all and end all of everything. It's not, now I understand. Now that I know that David Byrne, grew up with Asperger's, that explains everything. It explains some things. It doesn't explain everything by any means.
I don't think it helps you understand what makes him tick. It just might help you understand when certain things happened, when someone snapped, when someone said a thing, when someone told a reporter a thing, a little bit more about what was behind that.
Yeah. And listen, I mean, the other thing that to me is in some ways at least as interesting, if not more interesting, these early love songs, or these weird abstract love songs that he wrote, the first batch, I'm not in love, and all of this sort of thing, the stuff that his one-time girlfriend, Andrea Kovacs, talked about in that way. And Andrea, of course, claimed to be the model for no compassion, which is one of the sort of the hallmarks of that period of his writing. Sure. Those are songs about somebody who is first of all not accepting the ground theme of popular music, which is romantic love, right? Let's face it. I mean, this is who's not willing to accept it at face value, who wants to sort of look at it from all these different sorts of angles, question whether it's necessary, hold it up. There's that wonderful scene in at the beginning of American Utopia where David is cradling a model of the human brain in his hand and sort of like pointing at various parts of it and this sort of thing. Well, that's sort of what he's doing in those early love songs too. Absolutely. He's holding the idea of a love song and he's saying to himself, boy, people seem really obsessed with this thing. They seem really fascinated. What's this all about? And do we really need it? And so on and so forth. And, a song like No Compassion, in that sense, can be seen as a little bit of an Asperger's manifesto in that way. It's like, this is somebody for whom, and this is what, by the way, one of the things that some people speak about in relation to empathy and high functioning autism is not the idea that people with high functioning autism don't have empathy. It's that empathy is an overwhelming emotion is such an overwhelming emotion for them that they have to sort of hold it at arm's length, right? And that's, I don't know, that again is a sort of subjective dimension of this. That people who deal with this are much more able to talk about than I am. But it's a fascinating way to look at it. Not that they lack the ability for it. That what the thing is so overwhelming to them that they have to sort of draw back from it in a certain way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, again, I feel it as I read through the book. It was present the whole time, and I
I'm
could see.
delighted to hear that.
I mean, I think that it would be. I'm not even sure who would read this book and not pick up on those threads, but I'm sure somebody will. But look, I guess someone looking through and flipping through the pages that are like, talk about burning down the house. But I mean, anyone who reads the book in any serious way will pick up on it, I think, and understand that it's presenting things in that way. But I guess, like I say, I wanted to just put it out there to say, I think that this is a book that is trying to take that empathetic, sympathetic approach. It's obviously a very intentional thing, and I think if somebody has never considered David Byrne as a person from that angle before, this is maybe a good starting place to do that. Again, I've said we could probably talk for 5 hours, but I feel like we probably got to wrap it up at some point. But would you like to plug the book one more time, tell people where they can get it, tell them when it's coming out, and if they want any more information about you, leave them with something that they can follow up with?
Sure, I'd be pleased to do all of that self-advertisement right now. So the book is published by Mariner Books, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. Its publication date is June 17th. It is oddly enough available on Amazon Books. But I always urge people, if you can possibly sort of put on your shoes and your, and your hat to go out and buy it from an independent bookstore, because that is the lifeblood of the world that I live in and work in. I will be doing, this is a long way from where you are, but I will be doing readings in New York City, in the Hudson Valley. I'm doing a reading at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I'm delighted to do, and hopefully much more than that. But that's something that unfolds as the book gets published, as the book gets reviewed, and all of that sort of thing. And the only other thing I'll say is that, I say this in the acknowledgments, and I guess I think it's important to say, the inspiration for this book is the music that these four people made together between 1975 and 1988. And while I do get into all of the tensions and all of the issues and all of the emotional drama between them, I dearly hope that the book places the weight of its emphasis on this extraordinary music that they made together, because that's the only reason we would be talking about any of this stuff at this point. That's the centerpiece to me, of any music writing, but of writing about Talking Heads.
Yes, no, I love that, and I hope that even though we were sort of goofing on some of the songs earlier, that it's clear that it's a serious book about the albums as well and the output. And someone else who I think has also had a flick through this book mentioned to me that it's one of the real successes of it in music, in terms of the addressing of the music, is how all the albums have their moment and they're all celebrated to one degree or another. And there's books about Talking Heads that don't do that, and they trash on some of the lesser appreciated albums. So I think it's coming musically, in terms of the approach to the music, it's definitely coming from the right place. And I think that your background as a musician, I also picked up on that as well, and the insights that you brought to it. So it really feels like a nice, well-rounded book. Plenty of pages there to dig into all of that. So obviously there was a lot to talk about, but those pages are full. So we all really appreciate the effort that you put into that. Thank you so much for your time talking to me today, and best of success with the book.
Rodney, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on this. And this has been a great warm up for something that I think I'm probably going to be doing quite a bit of in the next couple of weeks and months. So I'm very grateful for it.
Best of luck with it too.
Thank you.
So there you go. That was my conversation with Jonathan Gould, whose book Burning Down the House, Talking Heads and the New York Scene that Transformed Rock will be out very, very soon. I'd definitely love to know what you thought. What were your favourite bits? What were your least favourite bits? And what were the bits that left you scratching your head? There's going to be plenty more Talking Heads content coming out very soon. So as always, you just want to stay subscribed to the channel so you don't miss anything. And I'll be talking to you again very soon. Thanks so much for watching. I've been Rod. See you later.